Change is inevitable in every facet of life. You get older, you'll meet new friends, you'll lose old friends. No matter how hard you try and change it, some things will just change if you like it or not. And sometimes change can be a good thing. New opportunities to be had, new memories to be made. But I think it's pretty safe to say a lot of people are pretty hesitant to change, especially when the thing that's changing is something that means a lot to you. I love many video game series, and many of them have left a great impact on me in my formative years. As one of them people who does not exactly love change, even if it is for the better, I've seen some game series that I love change its core foundations, and even though the series may retain its name and some core aspects, it's changed from what it once was, and sometimes these changes are for the worse. Some people bounce off the new direction. It might sell poorly, it might review poorly, and it either kills the franchise, or years down the line they go back to its original direction and it finds its audience again. But on the other hand, there are the times when a series changes and it finds greater success than ever before, bringing in new fans and bigger name recognition and success for the series. In certain scenarios, it might turn a relatively niche series and shoot it into the stratosphere, making the series bigger and better than before. But for me, personally, a series changing for the better isn't always for the best. What do I mean by this? A series that you love finding more success than before, maybe finally getting the recognition it deserves. And if a game series doesn't sell well, game companies aren't exactly charities. They have no qualms about killing beloved franchises if they fail to make the numbers. Just ask Dead Space and F-Zero fans. But in the process of changing a series too much from its core, it can also isolate original fans, as the series won't be what they originally fell in love with today. So I want to go through some of the series that changed for the better, and how being a fan of those series becomes a bit of an identity crisis, and makes you question if you're even a fan anymore. But if you want to see more videos like this, as well as the best and upcoming hidden gems, please consider liking and subscribing, and let's get to it. There are a few developers out there having quite as good a run as Capcom have since 2017, revitalising some of their most beloved series and giving us some excellent new entries in Devil May Cry, Monster Hunter and Mega Man. Also not being afraid to release some experimental titles such as Exoprimal and Kunitsu-Gami. But of course, there's the most notable revival is what they have done with Resident Evil. Since the release of 7, the series has gone from strength to strength, with it truly becoming the survival horror series of the modern era, just like it was back in the 90s when it first released. Back then, there was no survival horror series, apart from maybe Silent Hill, that could even hope to compete with Capcom's juggernaut. And Resident Evil went from hit after hit after hit, with Resident Evil 1, 2, 3 all selling big numbers, and even spin-off titles like Code Veronica ended up selling really well. But there was a big gap between new releases after Code Veronica. But when it did come out, Resident Evil 4 came out and made a bang, over the next couple of years becoming the best-selling game in the series at the time, as well as having the highest review scores in the series as well. But Capcom took a bit of a risk with Resident Evil 4, as all the previous games were survival horror through and through. Cramped areas, limited resources, and pretty bare-bones combat. But 4 was different. The combat in 4 was a departure from the original trilogy, becoming a lot more action-based. There was a lot more enemies on screen, and there was a lot more ways to deal with them. Leon had gone from a police rookie in Resident Evil 2 to secret agent working for the president in Resident Evil 4, and he has a lot more skills in his repertoire for you to use. And this proves to be a popular choice for both fans and sales, as Resident Evil 4's more action-centric route became the new direction for the series. This proved to be a pretty positive change for most of the fanbase, as even though the game had more action-based elements, it was still a horror game at its core, with its setting and monster design. It did upset some purists, but when it came to the sales numbers, review scores and overall fan sentiment, it can't be argued that the series had changed for the better. And with Resident Evil 5, the sales only went up, with this being still the highest selling game in the series. 5 doubled down on the action and toned down the horror from 4, making 5 essentially an action game with a horror aesthetic. And fans and critics definitely didn't gel with 5 like they did with 4, but it still had its defenders, and to this day, people will still defend Resident Evil 5, as it's definitely a solid enough game, but it'll definitely the start of the decline. But by a sales metric, which like I said before, is important, Resident Evil had changed for the better, as the games were still selling well, and that carried on with Resident Evil 6. Although not as many copies as 5, Resident Evil 6 still sold a lot, but the sentiment around 6 were and still are awful. Fans hated it, critics hated it, and to be honest, you'll struggle to find someone even now to say a kind word about the game. This is without a doubt the most disliked game of all the mainline games from a general public point of view. The game wasn't even pretending to be a horror game anymore. The game had abandoned the series' core identity and had become just another action game, which in 2012, when this was released, were a dime a dozen. The series' reputation was in the gutter, and so Capcom took a break from the main series for 5 years and released some spin-offs in between that had some moderate success. But in 2017, they went back to Resident Evil's roots with 7. 7 was straight up survival horror, although this time they went with a first person perspective, bringing some new while going back to the old, and this of course led them to the success that the series is in now. It's funny really, as the sales for 6 were really good, so they could have carried on with the same action focused direction, but Capcom saw that their audience wasn't resonating with the new releases, despite the sales, so went back to the original formula, showing that they cared about the reputation of their franchise, and most importantly, their original fans, who were screaming out for Resident Evil to go back to its roots. Personally, I jumped on with the Resident Evil 2 remake, so I've never known any different, but I'm glad Capcom have gone back to the survival horror roots, as I think that's where the series is at its best. But not every series gets that same treatment. When you think of change in video games, Ubisoft is probably the 53rd name that comes to mind, as the company in recent years have been the epitome of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, and if it's broken, people will probably still buy it anyway. But many years ago, they did come up with some original ideas, and back in 2007, they struck gold with a little known series known as Assassin's Creed. A series that has gone from a beloved series to a series which certainly has its die-hard fans, but its reputation has certainly been up and down over the years. But back in 2007, there wasn't a series that was doing the things that Ubisoft were doing with Assassin's Creed, and the sales and the reviews speak as much, for that as the first game, although has aged pretty poorly by today's standards, but for the time it was pretty impressive, and the series went from strength to strength for the next 8 years, as Ubisoft churned out game after game, steadily adding slight improvements to the series, but never changing the core formula too much from the original game. But the series was selling well and being reviewed well. Black Flag is one of the most beloved games in the series. I'm partial to 2 myself, but the games were a giant success for a reason, as they didn't tend to miss. That was up until 2014, and the release of Assassin's Creed Unity. The release of Unity still lives in infamy even today, as this was the first brand new Assassin's Creed exclusive to the next gen consoles at the time, and to say it was a technical disaster is putting it kindly. I don't think there's been a game with such a bad reputation on the technical side, apart from maybe Cyberpunk, but unlike Cyberpunk, Assassin's Creed Unity didn't get a redemption story. Unity's reputation was in the bin, and that affected not only its review scores, but also the sales for the game as well, as the sales were noticeably lower than previous titles, and that bled over to the next release of Assassin's Creed Syndicate. Although it wasn't played with the same terrible performance problems that Unity did, the damage had already been done, and the sales were even worse than Unity's. They weren't bad, mind you, but because it was lower than the other titles, this made Ubisoft stop and think that something needs to change to get the reputation of the series back on track. So the next game, Assassin's Creed Origins, was an actual change. Instead of a stealth series, Origin had changed to an RPG, and that's what the series has been ever since, with each entry, apart from Mirage in 2023, being RPG focused. And this did what Ubisoft wanted, making the series bigger than ever before and better than ever before. But in recent years there's been a vocal minority of old fans who are clamouring for the return of the older style, including myself, as the RPG games certainly aren't bad games, in fact they're really good games. It's just a strong feeling that the series has lost its core identity from the action stealth series it was back when it first started. And although Mirage went back to a lot of the series' roots, it was only a one-off, as Shadows was the same open world RPG formula, but due to the sales success of the RPG games, it would be again hard to argue that the series did change for the better. But as someone who loved the older games, especially 2 and Syndicate, I don't think Ubisoft will be changing the formula back to it anytime soon. The Legend of Zelda turns 40 years old this year, and over those 40 years, the series hasn't been afraid of change. In fact, the first 3 entries were different from one another, as Nintendo were trying to establish what Zelda was. The first game was the definition of, this is your adventure, off you go, as the game just drops you in and lets you figure it out for yourself. No guidance, no hand-holding, it was down to you to figure out and what to do and where to go. For 1986, it was very ahead of its time, and there was nothing else like it, making it a big success for Nintendo. So how do you follow up your very successful first entry in your new franchise? You completely change up the sequel to make it nothing like the original game that everyone loved. Yeah, Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link is the dark sheep of the Zelda franchise for a reason. Instead of a top-down perspective, Zelda 2 switches to a side-scroller with RPG stat progression. It doesn't even resemble anything what the first game was, and anything the series turned into. Safe to say, despite the game selling relatively well, it received more mixed reviews compared to the first. So with A Link to the Past, the next game in the series, they went back to a top-down perspective like the first game, but this time with a linear progression path, and this cemented itself as the core formula for the series going forward. You go to a dungeon, you get item, you use item to beat dungeon, rinse repeat until you finish the game. A formula that brought a lot of success and love to the Zelda series, as chances are most people watching this video grew up playing Zelda. You played one with this formula. That includes myself. I grew up playing Wind Waker, Ocarina of Time, Twilight Princess and Skyward Sword. I loved and still love these games very deeply. The reason I love gaming as much as I do to this day is because of The Legend of Zelda. But Nintendo, a company that's not happy to just rest on their laurels, well, unless it comes to Pokemon. After 26 years of the same formula and declining sales of Skyward Sword compared to Twilight Princess, Nintendo went back to the original formula for Zelda, where Breath of the Wild, no more dungeons, no more dungeon items, and the big selling point, an open world and open-ended level design, where you could go and do anything you wanted, whenever you wanted. There was no linear progression, compared to the other games since A Link to the Past. Now this was a pretty big change for the Zelda series. Its approach wasn't completely brand new, but because a core amount of the Zelda fans grew up with games like Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess. So changing the formula, there was always the chance that this change might alienate a large amount of your core fanbase. But Breath of the Wild didn't do that. No, in fact Breath of the Wild saw an unprecedented amount of success after release, becoming one of the highest reviewed games and one of the highest selling Switch games of all time. As well as far surpassing any other Zelda game that came before it, it seemed that Nintendo's gamble had worked out for them, and the Zelda series had become more popular than ever, and even the old school fans were pretty happy with the changes, especially after the game had just come out. You would have struggled to find a fan on the internet who was unhappy with the changes. Well, apart from me. Now I don't think Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom are bad games, far, far, far from it. I think they're great games. But as a longer term Zelda fan who grew up with the series and absolutely adored it, I believe that the formula change wasn't needed, and I struggled to connect with the new games like I did with the older ones, and that's because they stripped out a lot of what I loved about those older games. But at the time I felt completely alone in that way of thinking. I wanted my linear progression with a decent narrative, I wanted to get new items to solve new puzzles, and I wanted my linear design dungeons with only one way of progression. I was disappointed to say the least, but looking at the sales of both Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, and with Eiji Aonuma, longtime producer of the Zelda series, basically saying you can't see a future where we go back to the old formula, it's clear to see that Zelda has changed for the better. But I tell you something, it definitely hasn't changed for the better for me. But I'm in the minority, I know. There's been more of a vocal minority speaking out lately about a return to classic Zelda, but I just don't see a world where we ever get it back. Yeah, I get it. There's some fans of series out there who haven't had a new release in their favourite series in many years, due to lack of interest or sales, scoffing at me, because my favourite series is still getting new games. But when they cut the main components of what you love in a series, is it even your favourite series anymore? If you watch to the end, thank you. Please consider liking and subscribing, as it helps a small channel like mine out massively. And let me know in the comments what favourite franchise of yours changed for the better, and if you prefer it how it is now, or like with me and Zelda, you would wish it would go back to the old style. So thank you for watching, and hopefully I will see you again.